Elijah Rivers sat by the window, his pencil tapping rhythmically against his notebook. It wasn't nerves, just a habit, one his mother always told him to break. But it helped him think. Jefferson Middle School in Little Rock, Arkansas, buzzed with the usual pre-lesson chatter. Students joked, whispered, and passed notes. But Elijah stayed focused on his worksheet, determined to finish it early. At the front of the room, Miss Abigail Thornton skimmed through her notes. She had been teaching 6th grade for nearly 15 years and had earned a reputation, strict but fair. At least that's what people said. But Elijah knew better. She never called on him when his hand was up. When he answered correctly, she barely acknowledged it. But if he got something wrong, rare as it was, she lingered, almost enjoying the moment. Others noticed, too. "Yo, she barely even looks at you," Tyler Whitman, the boy next to him, whispered one afternoon. Elijah had only shrugged. "Guess I do." But today felt different. Today Miss Thornton was glancing at him more than usual, and Elijah had no idea why. The lesson began, history, something about the Civil War. Elijah took notes, expecting the usual routine, but then, Elijah. His head snapped up. Miss Thornton was watching him, her expression unreadable. "Why don't you answer this one?" Heads turned, whispers stirred. She never called on him. Elijah sat up straighter, scanning the board. General Sherman's March to the Sea was a military campaign aimed at breaking the Confederacy's resources and morale. Miss Thornton hummed. Not bad. It was a perfect textbook answer. A few students exchanged glances. Tyler shot him a look that said, "What was that about?" The lesson carried on, but the shift had happened. Miss Thornton wasn't ignoring him anymore. She was watching. The bell rang. Students began packing up, but Miss Thornton's voice cut through the noise. "Elijah, stay behind for a moment." A few heads turned, but no one spoke. Elijah took his time putting his notebook away before approaching her desk. "I overheard you talking the other day," she said, clasping her hands together, "about your grandfather." Elijah frowned. "What about him? You said he was a musician." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, he was a pianist, played jazz." Her lips curled slightly. Not quite a smirk, but close. "Interesting." She leaned back, tapping her fingers against the desk. "You must have picked up a thing or two." Elijah hesitated. Something about her tone felt off. "A little. Good to know." The bell rang. Elijah grabbed his bag, turning toward the door. "Tomorrow," she called after him, "let's see what you've got." He froze, turned back. "What?" "The piano in the corner." She gestured toward the old, dust-covered upright instrument at the back of the room. "You'll play something for the class." Elijah stared at her. A few lingering students had paused near the doorway, listening. "Why?" Miss Thornton tilted her head, amused. "Why not?" Elijah knew the real reason. She expected him to fail. Elijah barely slept that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in his head. This wasn't a request. It was a setup. Miss Thornton thought he'd stumble, embarrass himself. She wanted to prove something, maybe to herself, maybe to the class. But what she didn't know was that Elijah had been playing since he was 5. His grandfather had taught him every note, every chord, every rhythm. If she wanted a performance, she was going to get one. The next morning, word had spread. Whispers followed Elijah as he walked into class. "You gonna play today?" Brandon Hall smirked from across the room. Elijah didn't answer. "Didn't know you were a piano guy," Tyler murmured. Elijah kept his eyes on his notebook. There's a lot of things people don't know. Miss Thornton entered, setting her books down with a satisfied air. She barely acknowledged the students settling in, her focus drifting toward Elijah. The first half of the lesson dragged. Elijah barely heard any of it. His mind was locked on the moment she would call his name. And then, "Well," she said, closing her book, glancing at the clock. "We have a little time before the next lesson." "Perfect." She turned toward the piano. "Elijah." "Let's see what you can do." The air shifted. Students whispered. Chairs creaked, all eyes locked on to Elijah. He stood. Muffled laughs rippled through the room as he walked to the piano. Someone muttered something under their breath. Miss Thornton clasped her hands together. "Play whatever you'd like." Elijah studied the instrument. It was old. The keys were slightly yellowed, a few chipped. He pressed one lightly. The sound was off, just a little out of tune. He inhaled, sat down, rested his hands on the keys. A snicker came from behind him. Someone was expecting him to fail. Elijah wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing for himself, for his grandfather. His fingers pressed down. The first notes drifted into the air, smooth and steady, a blues progression, the kind his grandfather used to play on humid Arkansas afternoons. The classroom went silent. Miss Thornton's smirk faded. "And Elijah?" He kept playing. The classroom, once filled with chatter and skepticism, fell completely silent. Elijah's fingers moved effortlessly across the keys, the melody weaving through the room like a slow river. He felt it, the rhythm, the soul of the music. This wasn't just playing, this was storytelling. When he glanced up, he saw something rare. Miss Thornton looked surprised. Tyler's mouth was slightly open. Even Brandon, who had been smirking earlier, seemed caught off guard. Elijah finished the piece with a soft, lingering note. The silence stretched for a moment longer before someone finally spoke. "Dude," Tyler whispered. "That was insane." A few others murmured in agreement. Miss Thornton's expression shifted back to neutral, but something in her eyes had changed. She nodded. "That was unexpected." Elijah met her gaze. "Is that a good thing?" She studied him for a moment. "It's interesting." Then she turned back to the board, signaling that the moment was over. But it wasn't, not for Elijah. He had just rewritten the way people saw him. As soon as the bell rang, students swarmed him. "Where'd you learn to play like that? You take lessons or something? You got a YouTube channel?" Elijah shrugged off most of the questions, offering short answers as he packed up. Tyler walked beside him as they left the classroom. "So, why didn't you tell anyone you could do that?" Elijah exhaled, shifting his bag on his shoulder. "Didn't think it mattered. Guess it does now." As they reached the hallway, Miss Thornton's voice called out. "Elijah." He turned. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Come see me after school." A few students exchanged looks. Tyler nudged him. "What's that about?" Elijah had no idea, but he was going to find out. After school, Elijah hesitated outside the classroom before stepping in. Miss Thornton was at her desk, flipping through papers. She looked up. "Close the door." Elijah did. "You're talented," she said simply. He waited. There had to be more. "I misjudged you." She leaned back. "But now I see an opportunity." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "What kind of opportunity?" She handed him a flyer. "Jefferson Middle is competing in a statewide talent showcase next month. Our school hasn't had much luck in the past, but with you, that could change." Elijah read the flyer. It was a big event. Hundreds of students, judges, prizes. "Think about it," she said. "You'd be representing the school." Elijah stared at the paper. He had never played in front of an audience that big before. Miss Thornton watched him closely. "You have until Monday to decide." He walked out, heart pounding. This was more than just proving her wrong. This was a chance to prove something to himself. The weekend passed in a blur of uncertainty. Elijah sat at the piano in his living room, fingers resting on the keys. His grandfather's old sheet music lay beside him, worn at the edges. "Competition, huh?" His mom leaned against the doorway. He nodded. "You nervous?" "A little." She smiled knowingly. "That's a good sign." Elijah sighed. "What if I mess up?" His mom walked over, ruffling his hair. "Then you mess up. And you try again." He looked up at her. "You think I should do it?" "I think you already know the answer." She was right. On Monday, he walked straight to Miss Thornton's desk before class. "I'll do it." A flicker of approval crossed her face. Good. This was happening. The next few weeks were intense. Elijah practiced every day after school. The auditorium was his new second home. Miss Thornton arranged rehearsals, giving feedback, some encouraging, some brutally honest. "You're rushing the tempo. Your transitions need to be cleaner. Start again." She wasn't easy on him. But Elijah didn't want easy. Tyler and a few other classmates would sometimes sit in during practice. Each time, more people came. Word spread. "You're kind of famous now," Tyler joked one afternoon. Elijah just shook his head. "Nah, just playing." But deep down, he knew this was bigger than that. The night of the competition arrived. Elijah stood backstage, heart racing. The theater was packed. Students, teachers, judges. Miss Thornton appeared beside him. "Nervous?" he exhaled. "A little," she smirked. "That's a good sign." Elijah chuckled. "You sound like my mom." "Smart woman." His name was called. He walked onto the stage, blinking under the bright lights. The grand piano gleamed under the spotlight. He sat, closed his eyes, and played. The notes poured out, filling the space, drowning out every doubt, every whisper from the past. When he finished, silence hung in the air, then thunderous applause. Elijah looked toward the judges, then at Miss Thornton, standing at the edge of the stage. She nodded. For the first time, it felt like she truly saw him.